The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. Florida history and culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. In local government meeting rooms throughout the state, like this one in Brevard County, active citizens help to make history by influencing public policy. According to the experts, all it takes is passion for your issue, preparation, and perseverance. Bob Graham is one of Florida's most popular politicians. He served 12 years in the Florida legislature before becoming governor in 1978. He left office with an 83% approval rating and beginning in 1986 served 3 consecutive terms in the U.S. Senate. He created the Bob Graham Center for Public Service at the University of Florida. Attorney Chris Hand has served as speechwriter and press secretary for Senator Graham and was chief of staff for the city of Jacksonville under Mayor Alvin Brown. Together, Senator Graham and Chris Hand have written a book demonstrating how citizens can have a positive impact on government.
The book, America, the Owner's Manual, You Can Fight City Hall and Win, is a challenge to citizens to see democracy as being more than voting. Voting may be the single most important thing you do because that selects the people who will use their constitutional responsibilities to advance the interest of the nation. But it's not the end of your citizenship responsibilities. We all have the ability to shape our community and our state and our nation by our own action. And I think particularly at this point in American history, it's especially critical that people don't go into a defensive crouch and say, I don't like what's happening, I'm going to check out. This is the time to check in with active citizenship. The purpose of our book is to first motivate people that is possible. And so we have many stories about citizens who saw a problem or a missed opportunity, and they took advantage of it. And many of those stories come right out of Florida.
For those who are pleased with the election results, the question has been, what do we do now to hold elected officials accountable to the change they've promised to bring? And to those who are disappointed by the election results, it's, did I do enough? Are there other ways that I can get involved? And so this book is hopefully one of the answers to that question. America, the Owner's Manual, You Can Fight City Hall and Win, helps to provide a step-by-step guide to citizens who want to build and flex their citizenship muscles and make government respond on a challenge or a problem they've identified in their community. But it doesn't just provide the 10 steps. We can give that advice. We wanted them to hear from other people as well. That's why there are 35 so-called tips from the pros in the book, specific essays of advice from civic professionals around the country, pollsters, political consultants, financial experts, mayors, former members of Congress, to help them put that advice in some context. And even more importantly, the examples of other citizens who have built and flexed their citizenship muscles to make government respond. So both the overall book and each chapter leads with the example of a citizen or a group of citizens who have used the skills of effective citizenship to make government listen to them and take seriously their concerns.
It wasn't that long ago that there was a strong proposal to demolish what is now South Beach. The economic and political leaders of the city felt that Disney had built a wall across Florida and that tourists wouldn't come south to their traditional places such as Miami Beach unless they had similar tourist attractions to Disney. And so the idea was to take down much of the old architecture, the Art Deco sections, and build a theme park. There was one lady named Barbara Capitman who said that's a very bad idea, and that in fact the future of Miami Beach is to restore this Art Deco building, remind people of positive experiences in their own personal and family life that were associated with South Beach. And her persistence and her skill in manipulating a very complex bureaucratic process to get South Beach designated as a national historic district were the keys to saving South Beach and really saving Miami Beach as an international destination.
That was pioneered by an incredible woman named Barbara Capitman, a recently widowed historic preservationist who was concerned about efforts to raise the historic Art Deco structures. And she did something quite remarkable. In addition to building a coalition, she thought very carefully about which level of government can really help me in this situation. And she thought beyond just sort of, well, this is a local or city government matter. She thought, is there another level of government that could play a role? When she kind of hatched upon the idea that the South Beach could be added to the Federal Register of Historic Places, that became her goal, that she worked at multiple levels of government until she was successful. And I think many people now are very glad that she did, because she preserved something that truly is a historic treasure in Florida, but also left an organization, the Miami Design Preservation League, that continues to work on these issues in Miami Beach. In fact, one issue they're very focused on right now is what is the impact of potential climate change on historic structures in Miami Beach and on the city in general. So she not only saved these structures, effectively used government, and did so almost as a one-person band in many cases, but also left this legacy in which historic preservation continues to be emphasized and protected in Miami-Dade County.
Another example of effective active citizenship involves people from the Florida Keys fighting a dramatic increase in insurance rates.
Anyone who lived here in Florida in 2004 and 2005 remembers the just sort of one hurricane after another that we experienced in this state that affected almost every part of the state. But strangely enough, especially given their location, the one part of the state that was not affected by those storms was the Florida Keys. While many other parts of Florida were hit by hurricanes, the Keys left that 2-year hurricane cycle relatively unscathed. So you can imagine the surprise of many Keys homeowners when they opened their property insurance bills and saw that their rates had skyrocketed, largely on the fact that these hurricanes had come to Florida. Well, since they hadn't come to the Florida Keys, they were surprised about the fact that their bills had skyrocketed. So they used one of the most important skills of effective citizenship. They did their homework. They consulted with experts, they did research, and they learned that these rate increases really weren't based on anything justifiable. Having done this excellent homework and turned themselves into credible citizen advocates, they took their case to Tallahassee and were successful in having these insurance increases rolled back. So we use that story as an example of why it is so important to do your homework, know your facts, be a credible citizen advocate, and if you are that, you have a much greater chance of success in making government respond.
If you want to know what America is going to be like 50 years from now, I don't know of a better place to study that than Florida. I think Florida is the precursor of an America which is more diverse, more mobile, has a more diverse set of lifestyles being lived within it. And I'm proud that we can give the nation a model of how diversity can be a strength, not a source of division. So I think Florida's role will grow over the next decades, and we'll see other cities looking to cities of Florida to ask how did they deal with that problem back at the early part of the 21st century, because we've got it big time now.
In 1987, the town of Eatonville, Florida, celebrated its centennial as the oldest incorporated African-American municipality in the United States. That same year, community organizer N.Y. Nathiri attended a public hearing about the proposed widening of Kennedy Boulevard into a 5-lane road. Listening to the discussion, Mrs. Nathiri realized that the project could destroy her historic hometown.
The first thing that came into my mind was, this is a classic community busting road, because and the implications of it being a community busting road were that the historic significance of Eatonville would be destroyed, because from Political Science 101, I remembered there are 3 ways that you destroy a community. You either remove a school, you remove houses of worship, or you insert a highway. And so this was textbook, literally textbook. The problem, of course, was that the way process works, the public hearings were pro forma. The staff had already determined what the recommendation was going to be for to the county. We didn't realize that, of course, and by the time that the commission hearing, which again was very cynically placed in terms of time, Eatonville had completed its centennial celebration. The hearing was the Monday before Thanksgiving, the beginning of the holiday season. No one's going to pay attention. Even if you are concerned, it's Thanksgiving, it's Christmas, it's New Year's, so nothing's going to. It's a fait accompli, psychologically as well as legally.
The Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community was organized to fight the destructive road project and save the historic community made famous in the books of writer, folklorist, and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston. The group formed a coalition with their predominantly white neighbors in Maitland.
I became a reluctant spokesperson, and I remember the late Mr. Frank Otey and other people saying, PEC cannot just say, you don't want the road. That's not going to work. You're going to have to talk about alternatives. And your alternatives are going to have to be based on what is knowledge that is, in other words, it can't be emotional. So immediately that meant that we were engaging with planners, with engineers, looking at the technical case for the road. What was the technical case and why was that flawed? That was one part. And then the other part was, what were you advocating? What is this about historic Eatonville? What is it about Eatonville that is special? If you can imagine, in 1987, and this is not an exaggeration, the decision makers, the opinion shapers, in other words, white Orange County, had not heard of Zora Neale Hurston. They didn't know Zora Neale, they did not know that name. As a matter of fact, about this time, there was an alcoholic beverage that was being developed or promoted called Zima. Okay, so we had to make sure that is Zora, Zima. I mean, what is this? It really, in some ways, it was funny, but not funny. So our case was 2-pronged. One, to say that there was no technical reason to improve the road, and then the other was, but don't you know about Eatonville and Zora Neale Hurston and the fact that this little town is historically significant? I mean, do you know that? And so that was our job.
As part of a public awareness campaign, the Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community organized what is now called the Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities.
By the fall of 1988, we were planning for the first Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts because we knew we had to educate the public. So many of us came out of the education field, but we couldn't be pointy-headed intellectuals. I mean, that was not going to work. We wanted to let the public know about the historic significance of Eatonville and about Zora Neale Hurston, who really, a lot of people know about Zora Neale Hurston, even though you may not know about her, Central Florida. And so we had to make that case. And the way that we said we could do that was by a festival of the arts. We were very intentional about this. Public programs, exhibitions, in other words, ways to pull the general public in to let them know. And so that is what we did. And again, not realizing what we were doing, or the impact of what we were doing, all of this was occurring before people talked about ecotourism, heritage tourism, cultural tourism. Those phrases were not a part of the lexicon of tourism. And when we organized the first festival in 1990, we had 10,000 people coming to this little community. Those are not exaggerated figures, though we literally were able to count. And not only did we have that kind of number, but all of the names that you would want to have. Miss Ruby Dee, the late Miss Ruby Dee, Dr. Robert Hemingway, her literary biographer, Alice Walker, who at this time was a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist, but of The Color Purple. But the big thing was that The Color Purple had become a movie, and so everybody knew about The Color Purple. You know, there were those of us who said if this was just a book, it would not have been the impact. But the movie, and she had agreed to come. So, and we'd also done a call for academic papers. We had 55 scholars to respond.
PEC continues to present the annual Zora Festival and benefits the community by operating the Zora Neale Hurston National Museum of Fine Arts and the Excellence Without Excuse Computer Arts Lab. It took 10 years for the organization to get Eatonville designated as a National Historic District, but their persistence was rewarded.
We had the ability to really bring to bear a constituency's voice, not only at the federal level, but at the county level, because of course it all sifts down. So we have a way of actually processing. But yes, you do have to be persistent, absolutely. And the reason that persistence can work with government is that as long as you stay focused, government can't stay on your issue by itself. It's got too much to do. This is really the case. As long as you are laser focused and your case is credible and you keep moving, and you are able to continue to expand the public discourse, yes, with persistence, it really is the case in terms of public. Private money, however, can get things done very quickly, and can do a lot of damage. We saw that happen. We saw that happen in Eatonville with some initiatives. But public, yes. Persistence, yes, passion, and if you can make the good case, you just have to stick. You have to stick with it. We are We are very fortunate in this country. Democracy, I mean, we are very fortunate. We are very fortunate, and as I'm at this point in my life, my concern is that Americans really, truly understand the treasure, the precious treasure that we have living in a democracy.
Co-authors Bob Graham and Chris Hand illustrate how, in a democracy, a coalition of seemingly unlikely partners can bring about positive social change. One example of such a coalition is the partnership between the LGBT and business communities in Tampa Bay.
Yes, and we talk a lot about coalitions in the book because this is such an important aspect of citizen engagement. The old expression is the strength of the wolf is in the pack. And the more different organizations, people you can bring in to help champion your cause, the greater an opportunity you're going to have to be successful. The example you're referring to, Ben, it occurred in Hillsborough County, where the Hillsborough County Commission in the mid-1990s decided to remove sexual orientation and gender identity as matters that should be protected under that county's human rights ordinance. This was obviously a matter of great concern to the Tampa Bay LGBT community, and they immediately began work to try and reverse that decision. But they realized that they wanted to sort of have as big a net of supporters as possible when they were taking these concerns to try and get them reversed at the Hillsborough County Commission. So they joined forces with the Tampa Bay business community, which was very concerned about the message of intolerance and lack of inclusion that not having sexual orientation and gender identity in that human rights ordinance would send to businesses who might be looking to relocate to Tampa Bay. So as a result of this coalition, the Hillsborough County Commission not only reversed itself and included sexual orientation and gender identity in their human rights ordinance, but also added one of the state's first domestic partnership registries and took other actions to show that Hillsborough County wanted to be seen as tolerant and inclusive. So it was the power of that coalition. In fact, the title of that story, which is actually written by Nadine Smith, who's the executive director of Equality Florida, is called Equality Means Business. And that really captures well what happened there. A coalition of people who come at this from slightly different perspectives but have the same goal in mind can be very powerful in helping citizens achieve the goals they want with government.
I think there are three things that are necessary for citizens to be effective in the use of their rights and responsibilities. One, they've got to be passionate. Barbara Caperman was passionate about saving those Art Deco buildings on South Beach. Two, you've got to be skilled. Citizenship isn't intuitive. You're not born with an automatic awareness of what it takes to be an effective citizen. It is a skill like playing a sport or a musical instrument. And then third, you have to be persistent. Barbara, it took her the better part of 5 years. In fact, she died before the full realization of what she had set out to accomplish was reality. So passion, skills, persistence, I think are the three keys, and America, the Owner's Manual, tries to take those and expand on what specifically you can do in order to master especially the skills of effective citizenship.
Positive social change often begins with dedicated individuals in local government meeting rooms like this one. People just like you make history through active citizenship. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. Florida history and culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org.